Hi, my name is Mike Gant, and this is episode 29, I think, yes, of Bible Mechanics. And today I want to talk about um, the history of the Bible, or a Bible development timeline. We're going to go from about 1500 BC to the present and describe some of the key milestones in the production of the Bible, because as you probably know, the Bible wasn't produced all at once. It was produced over a period of time, actually about 1500 years altogether, 1500, 1600. And I'm going to use time in relatively rough terms, not trying to get that precise, but to focus rather on just trying to get some sense of the magnitude of time, the great length of time it took to pull all these things together. Now, to do this, I'm going to actually read from what I printed out from my website. And the way for you to get the most out of it is not to sit here. You'll be pleased to know is not to sit here and look at me while I'm talking about this, but actually go to the website and have this up in front of you as I walk you through it, and maybe even print it out like this, whichever you find easier. But I'll just start through, and I think it's really amazing how God did all this, but He used people to do it. So that's another reason it takes a long time, is it's not that easy to get people to do things. So this is titled The History of the Bible. Another place I title it Bible Development Timeline. I'll put the link to it in the description box below this video. But you can also just do a search. There's a search function on the website that allows you to put in those phrases, and you may need to put them in quotation marks. But at any rate, here we go. The Bible is an ancient collection of even more ancient texts. That refers to the fact that the Bible was written a piece at a time. Bible translators and publishers provide us many conveniences that make the writing more accessible than it would otherwise be. Those are called paratext functions. Here's a rough timeline of how the Bible as we know it today came together. 15th century BC, Moses writes the first 5 books of the Bible. The Bible did not begin with Adam and Eve. It did not begin with Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or even Joseph. It didn't happen until the time of Moses. And the primary reason for that is so that there would be a nation to protect these documents. Just like in the United States of America, we've got the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Those are guarded and protected in Washington, D.C. And certainly the scriptures of Israel needed a nation to protect them over the centuries. And that began with the 5 books of Moses. Now, the New Testament will be a different story. I'll say something more about that when we get there. About 500 years after this, which would be about the 10th century, David writes the Psalms. So all the other books were written in between Moses, which was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then the rest of the books of the Old Testament up to the book of Psalms. And then by the 4th century, the last of the Old Testament books were written. So 15th century Moses BC, 10th century BC, David writes the Psalms, and then 4th century BC, before Christ, of course, the last of the Old Testament books is written. And that amounts to 37 texts of the Old Testament over a roughly 1,000-year period from 1500 BC to roughly 4th century BC. Then in the 1st century AD, the 27 texts that comprise the New Testament were written. So the New Testament texts were written all in 1 century, compared to the Old Testament text, which took roughly 15 centuries. In the 2nd century, we see the first canon list of New Testament contents, the first time sort of a list of what we would call a table of contents was put together. Some dated in the 2nd century and others in the 4th. In any case, all we have is a fragment of that canon. Scholar Michael Kruger argues that in the 3rd century, Origen of Alexandria in essence, declared a 27-book canon around 250 AD, more than 100 years before Athanasius did it. I'll say more about that in the next section. So the 4th century AD is when we really start getting a lot of what are called canon lists. And this is where a governing church authority, like a diocese or synod or region, most of the cities at that time were, most of the churches at that time were organized under a city or a region, and you had a bishop over that. So these various bishops would publish lists. Okay, here are the books that we read, and they were reading all the Jewish books. That is what we call the Old Testament, but they were also reading now these New Testament books. So it says here, I say here, since I wrote it, the near universal testimony of the 4th and 5th century churches, which were organizationally independent and geographically dispersed, was that the 27 texts collectively called the New Testament, written in the 1st century by the authors named with each text, and handed down from one generation to the next over the intervening period of roughly 300 years. I won't read the detail here, but it lists out various ones. And probably the most notable one was the church bishop named Eusebius, who wrote in the early 4th century a history of the church up to that point. And so there had been no church histories written since the book of Acts. So he wrote a church history. He was not trying to write scripture per se. He was just trying to be a good historian. And that has a lot of useful information today and is still used. For example, here is a copy of Eusebius's church history. Print's not too big or too small, and a lot of good information in here, including when or who wrote the different books of the New Testament. Then in the 5th century AD, the Bible was translated into Latin by Jerome, and that Latin translation would be the primary translation of the Bible for the next 1,000 years. Then the 13th century, this is well over 1,000 years from the translation of the Vulgate, we get the chapter divisions in the Bible. The chapter divisions we see in the Bible today were added. Verse divisions wouldn't be added until the 16th century, another 300 years after this. And I've got a write-up on that too. In the 14th century, John Wycliffe translates the Bible from Latin into English. So I think I'll use this as a stopping point. We've gone from the 15th century BC to the 14th century AD. That's roughly 3,000 years time. And we started with Moses, and we're just now getting to the point where the Bible gets translated into English. Of course, people weren't speaking English when the Bible was written. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew mainly, and the New Testament was mainly written in Greek. But we will pick this up next time and finish it, and I look forward to that. Thank you.